Hello, this is video lecture number 90, The Emerging Civil Rights Struggle. We have several subsections that we are covering today. The first is life under Jim Crow, then the origins of the civil rights movement, World War II, the beginnings, and then Cold War civil rights, Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans, and finally the legal strategy and Brown versus Board of Education. So the civil rights movement emerged as one of the most important forces for social change in post-war America. President Truman confronted these difficulties in his efforts to achieve his fair deal, an expansion of the New Deal that would lead to the attainment of civil rights for African Americans in a post-war period very different from the 1930s. Not only did Republicans control the Congress during the second half of Truman's first term, but the left and right wings of his own party staged revolts in 1948, running national tickets of their own. The issue of civil rights was central to the growing anger of Deep South Democrats with the National Democratic Party. Still, Truman won re-election, and his party recaptured Congress. The landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka declared segregation of public schools to be unconstitutional, thereby bringing national attention to civil rights. So let's have a closer look at the emerging struggle with our first subsection, life under Jim Crow. Racial segregation and economic exploitation defined the lives of the majority of African Americans in the post-war decades. Numbering 15 million in 1950, African Americans were approximately 10% of the U.S. population. In the South, however, they constituted between 30 and 50% of the population of several states, such as South Carolina and Mississippi. Segregation, commonly known as Jim Crow, prevailed in every aspect of Southern life. In Southern states, where 2/3 of all African Americans lived in 1950, blacks could not eat in restaurants patronized by whites or even use the same waiting rooms at bus stations. In the North, racial segregation in everyday life was less acute but equally tangible. Northern segregation took the form of a spatial system in which whites increasingly lived in suburbs or on the outskirts of cities, while African Americans were concentrated in downtown neighborhoods. There was greater freedom for African Americans in the North and West than in the South. For example, blacks could vote, participate in politics, and at least after the early 1960s, enjoy equal access to public accommodations. However, poverty and racial discrimination were also deeply entrenched in the North and in the West. Our next section then is the origins of the civil rights movement. A series of factors came together in the middle of the 20th century to make a broad and unique movement possible. An important influence was World War II. In the war against fascism, the Allies sought to discredit racist Nazi ideology. Committed to an anti-racist ideology abroad, Americans increasingly condemned all forms of racism, even those at home. The Cold War placed added pressure on U.S. officials as well. To inspire other nations in the global standoff with the Soviet Union, Truman explained, quote, "We must correct the remaining imperfections in our practice of democracy." Among the most consequential factors also was the growth of the urban black middle class. Historically small, the black middle class experienced robust growth after World War II. Its ranks produced most of the civil rights leaders. We also have churches, who for centuries were a sanctuary for black Americans. They were especially important in producing leaders. So were African American colleges. Their students were part of the largest expansion of college enrollment in U.S. history. They joined the civil rights movement, adding new energy and fresh ideas. Also influential were labor leaders, who were generally more equality-minded than the rank and file. But trade unions such as the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, and the Communication Workers of America, among many others, were reliable allies at the national level. Also, the new medium of television played a crucial role. When television networks covered early desegregation struggles, such as the 1957 integration of Little Rock High School, Americans across the country saw the violence of white supremacy firsthand. Okay, let's go to the next section then, World War II, the beginnings. During a war intended to make the world safe for democracy, America was far from ready to extend full equality to its own black citizens. Black workers faced discrimination in wartime employment, and while more than 1 million black troops served in World War II, they were placed in segregated units commanded by white officers. On the home front, activists pushed two strategies. A. Philip Randolph, whose Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was the most prominent black trade union, called for a march on Washington in early 1941. Randolph planned to bring 100,000 protesters to the nation's capital if African Americans were not given equal opportunity in war jobs. To avoid, then, a divisive protest, FDR issued Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries, and Randolph agreed to cancel the march. The resulting Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, was weak, but it set an important precedent: federal action in support of civil rights. A second strategy was the Double V campaign, a patriotic racial slogan that spread like wildfire through black communities across the country. African Americans would demonstrate their love of country by fighting the Axis powers, but they would also demand, peacefully but emphatically, the defeat of racism at home. Those efforts met considerable resistance. In war industries, factories periodically shut down in Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and other cities because of hate strikes, the refusal of white workers to work with black workers. Race riots also were one manifestation of white resistance to change. On a hot summer day, whites from the city's ethnic neighborhoods taunted and beat African Americans in a local park. 3 days of rioting ensued, in which 34 people were killed, 25 of them black. Federal troops were called in to restore order. Despite and because of such incidents, a generation was spurred into action during the war years. All right, let's move on to Cold War civil rights. African American leaders also had hopes for President Truman. Although capable of racist language, Truman supported civil rights on moral grounds. He understood, moreover, that the growing importance of the black vote in key northern states, and it was a fact driven home by his surprise 1948 victory. Lacking support in Congress for civil rights legislation, Truman turned to executive action. In 1946, he appointed a presidential committee on civil rights, whose 1947 report called for robust federal action on behalf of civil rights. In 1948, under pressure from A. Philip Randolph's Committee Against Jim Crow in Military Service, Truman signed an executive order desegregating the armed forces. The Cold War struggle, then, between the United States and the Soviet Union shaped post-war civil rights in both positive and negative terms. In a time of growing fear of communist expansionism, Truman worried about America's image in the world. The Soviet Union routinely used American racism as a means of discrediting the United States abroad. McCarthyism and the hunt for subversives at home also held the civil rights movement back. Civil rights opponents charged that racial integration was communist, and the NAACP was banned in many southern states as an anti-American organization. Black Americans who spoke favorably of the Soviet Union, such as the actor and singer Paul Robeson, or who had been fellow travelers in the 1930s, such as the pacifist Bayard Rustin, were persecuted by the House Un-American Activities Committee. The fate of people like Robeson showed that the Cold War could work against the civil rights cause just as easily as for it. All right, let's move on and look at Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans. In the Southwest, from Texas to California, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans endured a caste system not unlike the Jim Crow South. Labor activism in the 1930s and 1940s, especially in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, unions with large numbers of Mexican Americans, improved wages and working conditions in some industries, and produced a new generation of leaders. Additionally, more than 400,000 Mexican Americans served in World War II. Having fought for their country, many returned to the United States, determined to challenge their second-class citizenship. A new Mexican-American middle class also began to take shape in major cities, such as Los Angeles, San Antonio, El Paso, and Chicago, which, like the African-American middle class, gave leaders and resources to the civil rights cause. In Texas and California, Mexican Americans created new civil rights organizations in the post-war years. In Corpus Christi, Texas, World War II veterans founded the American GI Forum in 1948 to protest the poor treatment of Mexican American soldiers and veterans. Activists also pushed for legal change. In 1947, 5 Mexican American fathers in California sued a local school district for placing their children in separate Mexican schools. The case, Mendez versus Westminster School District, never made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Ninth Circuit Court ruled such segregation as unconstitutional, thereby laying the groundwork legally for broader challenges to racial inequality. In another significant legal victory, the Supreme Court ruled in 1954, just 2 weeks before the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, that Mexican Americans constituted a distinct class that could claim protection from discrimination. Also on the West Coast, then, Japanese Americans accelerated their legal challenge to discrimination. Undeterred by rulings in the Hirabayashi and Korematsu cases upholding wartime imprisonment, if you remember a few chapters ago, the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, filed lawsuits in the late 1940s to regain property that was lost during the war. These efforts by Mexican and Japanese Americans enlarged the scope of civil rights beyond demands by African Americans and laid the foundation for a broader notion of racial equality in the post-war years. All right, so let's have a closer look at Brown versus Board of Education. With Dwight Eisenhower as president, civil rights no longer had a champion in the White House. In the meantime, however, NAACP lawyers Thurgood Marshall and William Hastie had been preparing the legal ground in a series of test cases challenging racial discrimination. In 1954, they hit pay dirt. A landmark civil rights case, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, involved Linda Brown, a black pupil in Topeka, Kansas, who had been forced to attend a distant segregated school rather than the nearby white elementary school. The NAACP's chief counsel, Thurgood Marshall, argued that such segregation, mandated by the Topeka Board of Education, was unconstitutional because it denied Linda Brown the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. In a unanimous decision on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court agreed, overturning the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. In the South, however, the call went out for massive resistance. A Southern manifesto, signed in 1956 by 101 members of Congress, denounced the Brown decision as a clear abuse of judicial power and encouraged their constituents to defy it. That year, 500,000 Southerners joined white citizens' councils dedicated to blocking school integration. Some whites revived the old tactics of violence and intimidation, swelling the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan to levels not seen since the 1920s. President Eisenhower accepted the Brown decision as the law of the land, but he thought it was a mistake and was not happy about committing federal power to enforce it. A crisis then in Little Rock, Arkansas, finally forced his hand. In September 1957, 9 black students attempted to enroll at the all-white Central High School. Governor Orville Faubus called out the National Guard to stop them. Then the mob took over. Every day, the 9 students had to run a gauntlet of angry whites chanting things like "Go back to the jungle," as the vicious scenes played out on television night after night as these children just tried to go to school. Eisenhower acted. He sent 1,000 federal troops to Little Rock and nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, ordering them to protect the black students. Eisenhower then became the first president since Reconstruction to use federal troops to enforce the rights of African Americans. All right, this concludes our video lecture for today, The Emerging Civil Rights Struggle. Go ahead and answer your review questions at this time and continue on with your notes.